boiler room smelled like rust, machine oil, and 40 years of decisions made by people who actually understood what they were doing. I used to say you can tell everything about a manufacturing plant by who runs the floor and who runs the meetings. The floor guys know where the bodies are buried. The meeting guys just know how to talk about burying them. My name is not important right now. What matters is that I spent 22 years keeping Halverson Industrial's East plant running, not the glamorous part of the business. Not the sales floor or the executive suite on the third floor with the frosted glass and the espresso machine nobody knew how to use. The East plant, 12,000 square feet of heat exchangers, compressors, pressure vessels, and a cooling loop that had been patched together by 3 different engineers over 2 decades until the only person who truly understood it was me. I started there at 34, came in as a senior maintenance engineer after 15 years at a refinery in Ohio. I knew systems. I knew how metal fatigues, how seals fail, how a small pressure variance at 6 in the morning becomes a production shutdown by noon if you don't catch it. The plant manager at the time, a quiet man named Don, who wore the same green jacket every single day, shook my hand on my first morning and said, "I don't need you to be impressive. I need you to be right. I tried to be right for 22 years. Don retired in my 14th year. That was fine. People retire. What came after Dawn was the part nobody at Halverson liked to talk about. The new plant manager was brought in from corporate. He was 31. He had an MBA from a school with a good football team and a LinkedIn profile that used the word synergy, without any apparent shame. His name was Tanner. His father-in-law owned 40% of Halverson Industrial. That last part was not a secret. It was just something everyone agreed not to say out loud. Tanner walked the floor on his first day in shoes that cost more than my monthly truck payment. He asked good questions. I'll give him that. He wrote things down. He nodded at the right moments. But when I showed him the cooling loop and explained why the eastern secondary bypass needed manual monitoring twice per shift, he looked at me the way a person looks at a terms and conditions agreement, present but not reading. "We're going to modernize the monitoring process," he said. I said, "The automation system doesn't read the pressure variance on that loop correctly. I've logged it 4 times. There's a sensor calibration issue that maintenance has been working around manually since 2019. He wrote something down. Then he walked away to look at something that had a newer coat of paint. The first year was fine. We coexisted. I did my job. He did his meetings. The plant ran because the people who actually understood it were still there running it. The second year was when things started shifting. Tanner brought in a consulting firm. They were young. They used tablets. They made charts about efficiency and asset utilization and what they called knowledge redundancy, which I later understood was their word for experienced people who knew too much to be easily replaced and therefore represented a liability on a restructuring spreadsheet. I was 56 by then, 20 years in. My salary was toward the top of the range for my role. I had full benefits, a pension that was 11 months from vesting completely, and a detailed working knowledge of every mechanical quirk in that plant going back to 2003. On a Tuesday in March, Tanner called me into his office. His office had a standing desk he never stood at and a framed quote on the wall that said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." I always wondered if he knew where that quote came from. "We're making some structural changes," he said. He had a folder in front of him that he didn't open. I waited. "Your position is being eliminated." I looked at him. Not with anger. Not yet. Just looked. "The consulting team has recommended we consolidate the maintenance engineer roles and transition to a centralized monitoring model. The new system will handle most of what you've been doing manually." "The automated system doesn't read the secondary bypass correctly," I said. "I've documented this. It's in the maintenance logs going back 3 years. He nodded like I had said something about the weather. "I want you to know this isn't a performance issue," he said. "You've been an incredible asset to this company." I stopped listening after asset. Not because I was emotional, I was past emotional. It was just that I recognized I was in a conversation that had already been finished before I walked in. The folder in front of him was not a discussion. It was a formality. I handed over my badge, my access card, the laminated emergency contact sheet I'd kept in my top pocket for 18 years. I shook his hand because I was raised to shake hands even when I didn't want to. I walked to my truck. I sat there for about 10 minutes without starting it, Then I drove to a diner 3 miles down the state highway where I'd been eating breakfast on and off since 2004. And I ordered coffee and eggs, and I sat by the window and watched the morning traffic and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with the rest of a Tuesday. The next 3 weeks were quiet in a way that felt wrong. My wife kept asking if I was okay. I kept saying yes. I was not lying exactly. I was not in pieces. I was just recalibrating. 22 years of structure and then nothing. No 6 a.m. floor check. No pressure log. No call at 2 in the morning because the compressor on line 3 was throwing an error code. The no-call thing lasted longer than I expected. 11 days after I left, my phone rang at 11 in the morning. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. It was someone from the floor, a younger tech I'd worked with for 4 years, a solid guy who knew his trade and didn't panic easily. I could hear something in his voice that I hadn't heard from him before. "Hey," he said. "I'm not supposed to be calling you." I said I figured. "The secondary bypass," he said. "It's reading normal on the panel, but the loop temp is climbing. I've been watching it for 2 hours. The automated system isn't flagging anything." I asked where it was reading. He told me. I closed my eyes. I knew exactly what that meant. The sensor calibration drift I had documented, 3 years of maintenance logs. The system was reading ambient compensated temperature, not actual loop temperature. At a certain point, the divergence becomes serious. "How long since the last manual check?" I asked. He said they'd moved to automated-only monitoring 6 days earlier, Tanner's new system. Fully implemented. I told him what to look for. I told him what to check manually, where the actual thermocouple was, how to read it against the panel. I walked him through it while standing in my kitchen in a t-shirt I'd been planning to mow the lawn in. I said, "You need to escalate this now. Go directly to the floor supervisor and do not wait." He said, "I think Tanner is going to." I said, "I know what Tanner is going to do. Go to the floor supervisor anyway." We hung up. I stood at my kitchen counter for a while. My wife came in and asked who was on the phone. I said, "Work." She gave me a look that had about 15 years of marriage compressed into it. What happened next I pieced together over the following days from the tech, from a former colleague who was still inside, and eventually from documents that became part of a record I didn't expect to be part of. The loop temp continued to climb. The automated system continued to read normal. The floor supervisor escalated. Tanner was reached. Tanner contacted the consulting firm. The consulting firm said the system was functioning within parameters. The floor supervisor said he didn't think so. Tanner told him to trust the data. At 2:47 in the afternoon, a pressure relief valve on the secondary bypass opened. Automatically. As designed. That's what they're there for. It vented safely. No injuries. No fire. But the production line was down. And it stayed down. The East plant ran continuous production for an industrial chemical process supplier. Downtime was not a rounding error. Downtime was contractual penalties, emergency notifications, a cascade of logistics problems for the companies that depended on that output. My phone started ringing that evening. I didn't answer most of it. I answered the one from the tech because I wanted to make sure everyone was safe. Everyone was safe. The plant was not. Over the next week, Tanner apparently made a series of calls trying to get the system back online. The consulting firm sent people. They cannot get the cooling loop to stabilize without the manual monitoring protocol. The manual monitoring protocol existed only in my head and in the maintenance logs that I had written and that were, technically, company property. I don't know exactly when the calls from Tanner himself started. I blocked his number without quite meaning to, which meant the first 3 went to voicemail. I listened to all 3 voicemails in a row on a Saturday morning while drinking coffee on my back porch. The first one was professional. They were experiencing some technical challenges and my expertise and institutional knowledge would be greatly valued on a consulting basis. The second one was less professional. He'd like to discuss a short-term arrangement. Compensation would be generous. The situation was time-sensitive. The third one was a different person entirely. The corporate cadence was gone. He said the line had been down for 6 days. He said the contractual penalties were mounting. He said, and I remember this part very clearly because I played it back twice, "I need you to understand that whatever differences we had, the people on that floor are dealing with something serious right now." I sat with that for a while. Here is what I want to say about that moment, because I think it matters. I did not feel good listening to those voicemails. I am not the kind of person who takes pleasure in watching something break. I built things. I kept things running. That was the work. And somewhere in those 12,000 square feet, there were people I'd worked alongside for 2 decades who were standing around a line that wasn't moving and going home at night to families that depended on those jobs. That part was real. What was also real was that I was 56 years old, 11 months from full pension vesting, and I had been walked out of that building with a folder I was never allowed to read. I called my attorney. She is a sharp woman who has been practicing labor law for 27 years and who once told me, unprompted, that the best revenge is a well-documented paper trail. I had documentation going back 3 years. I had maintenance logs. I had the 4 formal written requests I had submitted about the sensor calibration issue. I had emails. I had the timestamp on every one. She listened. She asked questions. She took notes. Then she said, "Don't call Tanner back yet." I said, "What am I waiting for?" She said, "We need to check something first." The something she was checking turned out to be connected to Tanner's father-in-law. His name was Aldrich Halverson. He was the founder's son. He had been majority shareholder since his father passed in 2009. He was also, as my attorney discovered through sources I will not pretend to understand, the subject of an ongoing investigation by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the State Environmental Compliance Office related to a separate facility Halverson Industrial operated in another county. The specific nature of that investigation had to do with whether certain safety discrepancies at that facility had been knowingly concealed in compliance documentation submitted over a period of several years. My maintenance logs, my very detailed, very time-stamped, very professionally maintained logs, documented a pattern of deferred safety decisions at the East Plant that were consistent with what investigators were already looking at elsewhere. My attorney got a call from a federal investigator 9 days after our first conversation. I want to be careful here because some of this is still in process, and I was advised to be measured in what I say publicly. What I can say is this. I sat in a conference room with 2 investigators and my attorney for 4 hours. I answered every question they asked. I brought printouts of every log entry I had made over a 22-year period that I had kept, legally and properly, as copies of my own submitted work. I did not go into that room with any particular feeling about Tanner or his father-in-law. I went in because I was asked to go in, because I had documentation that was relevant to a legitimate safety investigation, and because 22 years of taking my job seriously turned out to mean something even after the badge was turned in. What happened to Aldrich Halverson and to the broader compliance investigation is a matter that is still moving through regulatory and potentially legal channels. I am not able to say more than that, and I wouldn't say more than that even if I could. What I can tell you is what happened to me. 2 weeks after I met with the investigators, I received a letter from Halverson Industrial's legal department. It was a settlement offer related to the wrongful termination claim my attorney had filed, which I have not mentioned until now because at the time it felt secondary to everything else. The offer was significant. I will not give you a number. My pension vested completely as part of the settlement terms. Tanner resigned from the plant manager position 4 months after the production line went down. The official reason given internally was that he was pursuing other opportunities. I heard this from my former colleague, who is still there and who told me with a tone of voice that suggested he found the phrasing as adequate as a paper bag in a rainstorm. The East Plant hired a new maintenance engineer. I was not consulted on the hire, and I did not expect to be. I hope whoever they found is good. I hope they listen to the 4 guys. I hope someone shows them where the secondary bypass thermocouple is and explains why you check it manually. I have a garden now. My wife has always wanted one, and I have always been too busy. We put in raised beds along the south fence in May, and I have spent more time than I would have predicted caring about whether tomatoes are getting enough water. It turns out that keeping a system running well is not so different whether the system is a pressure loop or a garden. You pay attention. You document. You don't trust a reading just because a panel tells you it's normal. My former colleague called me last month. Just to talk. He's been there 20 years himself. He said the new guy is fine. Asks good questions. Takes notes. I asked if he takes notes the way someone who means to read them takes notes, or the way someone who wants to appear attentive takes notes. My colleague laughed for a long time. I said to tell the new guy that the secondary bypass matters. Every shift, no exceptions. He said he would. I don't know if he did. I hope so. I spent 22 years being right about things that nobody wanted to hear. I was let go because being right for 22 years had made me expensive, and because the man who fired me confused the cost of experience with the cost of expertise. Those are not the same thing. One is a number on a spreadsheet. The other is what keeps 12,000 square feet from having a very different kind of Tuesday afternoon. I don't have a tidy way to end this. Life doesn't restructure itself into a clean conclusion. What I have is a garden, a vested pension, and a 4-hour conference room session that apparently matter to people with the authority to do something about what they heard. That's enough. That's more than enough. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the legal part, not the settlement, the human part underneath all of it. When Don ran that plan, he told me on my first morning that he didn't need me to be impressive. He needed me to be right. I held on to that for 22 years, not as a motto or reminder pinned above a desk, just as the quiet standard I measured every shift against. Was I right today? Did I catch what needed catching? Did I log what needed logging? That habit, that plain, unglamorous habit of paying attention and writing it down, turned out to be the thing that mattered most. Not my experience, not my title, not the years, the logs. 4 formal requests about a sensor calibration issue that nobody wanted to hear about. Time-stamped, filed, ignored by people who had decided that a spreadsheet could replace a person who understood what they were actually looking at. I think about Tanner sometimes, not with anger. I gave up angry somewhere around the second voicemail. What I think about is the specific kind of confidence it takes to walk onto a floor you don't understand and believe that your certainty is a substitute for knowledge. That's not a young person problem or an old person problem. It's a character problem, and character problems have a way of collecting interest over time. The cooling loop didn't fail because Tanner was malicious. It failed because he trusted a panel over a person, a system over experience, and his own confidence over documented evidence. That's a sequence of choices, not a moment of bad luck. And sequences of choices accumulate. They compound. They eventually produce a result that is entirely consistent with everything that came before it, even if it arrives as a surprise to the person who made them. That's the part I want people to take seriously, not the karma angle, not the satisfaction of watching someone else's poor decisions catch up with them, the actual mechanics of it. Every shortcut has a cost. Every ignored report is a debt. Every experienced person walked out the door without a real conversation is institutional memory that doesn't come back when you need it on a Tuesday afternoon. I didn't survive this because I was smarter than Tanner or more deserving of a good outcome. I survived it because I had been doing my job with honesty and precision for 22 years, and that work existed in black and white in maintenance logs that told the truth, regardless of what anyone wanted to believe. Resilience is not a feeling. It's not something you summon when things go wrong. It's what you've been building every ordinary day when nobody is watching and nothing dramatic is happening. The days when you check the secondary bypass even though the panel reads fine. The days when you file the report even though you know it'll sit in a drawer. Those days are the whole story. Everything else is just the moment when they count.